Hey, my love, it's Sherry Pearl, and you're listening to Dust of Passion Stories. Tonight's letter is about a woman who thought that part of her life was over until a neighbour's piano started playing through her bedroom wall. No apps, no profiles, just music, plaster, and a door she had to choose to open. Dear Sherry, I'm 42 years old, and until recently, I'd convinced myself that my body was done with surprises. I had my marriage, my children, my years of sharing a bed with someone who snored softly beside me. And then, suddenly, I had a quiet flat, two almost grown kids who only came on weekends, and an empty half of the mattress that felt bigger every night. I moved into this new apartment in February. A tall, old building with creaky wooden stairs and high ceilings that made every sound echo a little longer than it should. The agent described it as full of character. What he really meant was, you'll hear every neighbour sneeze through the walls. My first night there, I unpacked only the essentials: sheets, one lamp, a mug, my toothbrush. I was too tired to do more. I made myself a cup of tea, sat on the edge of my bed, and looked around at the half-open boxes and bare walls. It didn't feel like home yet. It felt like a waiting room between my old life and something I wasn't sure I deserved. And then, at 22 minutes past 10, it started. Softly at first, a handful of notes, almost uncertain, searching for each other. Then a slow, deliberate melody woven out of sound and silence. A piano, not perfectly tuned, not concert hall sharp, but warm and real and close. So close I could almost feel the vibrations in the mattress. It was coming from the other side of my bedroom wall. I froze, listening. Whoever was playing wasn't practicing scales or showing off. It was something simple, thoughtful, full of pauses long enough to breathe in. My body responded before my mind did. My shoulders dropped, my jaw unclenched. I realized I'd been holding my breath since I turned off the light. I turned onto my side, facing the wall. The music seeped through the plaster like warm water. Each note seemed to land somewhere between my ribs. I closed my eyes and let it move through me. It wasn't a song I recognized, but it felt familiar, like the sound of a heartbeat you haven't heard in a long time. I fell asleep with the piano still playing. The next morning, I woke up with dried tears on my cheeks. I hadn't even realized I'd been crying. The second night, it happened again. 10:22, as if someone had set an invisible clock. I was already in bed by then. This time I was waiting for it. I'd turned off the lamp a few minutes early, closed my eyes and listened to the quiet, until I heard the small scrape of the piano bench being pulled out on the other side of the wall. Then the first notes, hesitant, like a soft knock, then the same melody as before, but a little braver, a little deeper. I smiled in the dark. I didn't know who lived in 3A, the flat next to mine. The only thing I'd seen was a pair of worn boots by the door and a dark coat hanging on a hook in the hallway when I moved in. But listening to that music, I began to form an image. Hands, long-fingered, maybe with little calluses on the tips. Forearms with faint veins visible under the skin as they moved. A man leaning slightly forward over the keys, shoulders curved in that way people get when they carry the weight of their own thoughts more than boxes or furniture. I didn't know if any of it was true. It didn't matter. What mattered was that, for 20 minutes each night, I wasn't alone in my room. There was someone else awake with me, separated only by plaster and paint and a few centimetres of air. I made a ritual out of it. I began to notice that on the days when the piano sounded lighter, as if the fingers were dancing, I felt lighter too. On the days when the chords were lower, rougher, a little chaotic, my chest felt tight in sympathy. I began going to bed earlier just so I could lie there and wait for 10:22. I started buying nicer pyjamas. Not the old washed-out t-shirts I used to wear, but soft cotton with lace on the cuffs, satin that felt cool on my thighs. It felt silly at first to dress up for someone who had no idea what I looked like and might never see me. But I wasn't only dressing for him. I was dressing for the part of me that had been asleep from the neck down. The first night the piano stayed silent, I realised how deep it had gone. I turned off the lamp. 10:20 came and went. 10:22 slipped by. I lay in the dark, waiting for that first tentative note. All I could hear was my own breathing in the fridge, humming its indifferent tune. I waited 10 more minutes. Nothing. The silence felt heavier than the music ever had. I tried to tell myself it was ridiculous to feel abandoned by a neighbour who owed me nothing and didn't even know I existed. But the truth was, disappointment sat between my ribs like a stone. The next day, I wrote a note. I stared at the blank card for far too long before I began. To the neighbour with the piano, I wrote. I hope this doesn't sound strange. I just wanted to say, your music helps me fall asleep. I moved in recently, and this place still feels a bit like an empty box. Your playing makes it softer somehow. I missed it last night. I hope you're okay. 3B. I felt ridiculous, like a teenager with a crush on a voice down the phone. But I folded the note anyway and slipped it under the door of 3A when I left for work. All day, I thought about it. On the train, at my desk, between emails. What if he never saw it? What if he did and thought I was a creep? What if my neighbour was actually a 60-year-old woman with a piano and a bad hip? What if it was a child practicing for lessons? That night, when I came home, there was a folded card on my doormat. My heart thudded in my throat as I picked it up. To the neighbour who listens, it said in a neat, careful hand. I didn't know anyone could hear me through the wall. I'm glad it doesn't just annoy you. I've had a flu. That's why it was quiet. I'll try to play tonight. 3A. I read the card 3 times in the hallway before I even took off my coat. He existed, and he had read my words. And he knew that his music was not just a private habit in an old building. It had ripples. That night at 10:22, I lay in bed, facing the wall, my fingertips resting lightly on the cool paint. The piano woke up again. The melody was the same, but something in it had changed. It was careful, tender, a little shy, as if he knew I was listening now. As if this wasn't just for him anymore. I closed my eyes and let my hand slide down the wall until my palm was flat against it, fingers spread. The plaster was smooth and cool. I imagined his back on the other side, his shoulder blades moving gently as he played. I didn't touch myself. I just lay there, my legs drawn up, the thin fabric of my nightdress against my thighs. My palm on the wall and the sound of the piano like warm breath in my ear. For the first time in years, my body felt like it belonged to me again. The notes became our language. We began to leave each other messages, not every day, just sometimes. A card on my doormat. New piece tonight. I'm not sure about it. Let me know if it keeps you awake for the wrong reasons. 3A. A note on his. That sad part in the middle felt like getting lost and found again. I liked it. Little by little, we exchanged pieces of ourselves. He told me he worked from home, some kind of software job he could do in sweatpants and headphones. That the piano had belonged to his grandmother, and he'd never been good enough for a career, but he played to untangle his thoughts. I told him I'd got divorced a year before, that my kids lived half the week with their father, half with me, and on the nights they weren't there, the flat felt too loud with silence. I didn't tell him how long it had been since anyone had kissed my neck. I didn't have to. It was all there in the way I described the evenings. We never opened our doors at the same time. On the stairs, we heard each other's footsteps, but somehow we always passed like ghosts, one leaving just before the other arrived, a door closing gently at the end of the corridor. Sometimes I would press my ear to the wall as he played. My cheek cooled by the paint, my body warmed from the inside by the ripple of notes. I started noticing the way my breathing synchronized with the music without me trying. Long inhale on a rising phrase, slow exhale as the notes sank and settled. One night the piece was different. It started almost angrily, low chords, a rougher rhythm, the sustain pedal held down so the sounds blurred into each other. My heart raced. I turned onto my back, then onto my side again. My body wouldn't find a still position. Then, suddenly, the music softened. The right hand climbed gently up the keys, picking out a melody that was so tender it hurt. I rolled closer to the wall, the sheet twisting around my legs, my thighs pressing together. I slid my hand between the pillow and my cheek, not to touch anything, just to hold on to something as the sound moved through me. I didn't know what he looked like, I didn't know his name, but in that moment, no one had ever felt closer. The night we met, the city lost power. A storm rolled in late, with rain that slapped against the window glass and a wind that made the old building creak in its bones. I turned off the TV because I couldn't hear it over the weather anyway. I lit a candle and sat on my bed, watching the flame bend in the draught. At 10:22, the room went completely dark. The lamp flickered and died. The fridge hummed to a stop. The piano did not start. For a while I sat there in the deep, heavy silence that only happens when the modern world pauses. No traffic, no buzzing, no background hum. Just my heartbeat and the rain. Then there was a soft knock at my door. I hesitated, heart suddenly loud in my ears. For a second, I considered not answering. I was in an old t-shirt and bare legs, my hair pulled into a messy knot. Not how you want to look when you open the door to anyone, let alone the man whose music you've been in love with for weeks. The knock came again, gently. 2 short taps. I picked up the candle and went to the door. When I opened it, the corridor was lit only by a single flame in front of me. He was holding it. A small white candle in a plain saucer, and beyond it, his face lit from below. He was ordinary. Not a movie star, not some untouchable fantasy. Mid-40s maybe, like me. Dark hair with threads of silver at the temples, a bit too long, pushed back with one hand that still rested on his head. Stubble that had seen at least a day, maybe 2. Eyes the colour of strong tea, tired and kind at the same time. "Hi," he said softly. His voice was lower than I'd imagined, warmer. "I'm 3A. I laughed too quickly. "And I'm 3B, I replied. "I guess we've been shouting through paper walls long enough." "More like whispering," he said. The candle trembled slightly between us. I thought you might be awake, and I thought maybe you'd miss the piano more tonight than usual." I realised I was hugging my free arm across my chest, as if I could throw on a layer of armour made of skin. My t-shirt hung loosely, one shoulder bare. I felt suddenly, painfully aware of the line of my collarbone, the way the candlelight turned my skin gold. "I do miss it," I said, more quietly now. "It's become part of my night." He exhaled. I could see the relief in the way his shoulders dropped. "I can't play in the dark," he said. "Not well enough anyway. But I thought, electricity or not, music is still possible." He lifted the candle a little. "Would you like to hear it from the other side of the wall, just for once?" The offer hung there between us, soft and impossible to ignore. "Yes," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "I would." His flat was almost a mirror of mine, only lived in a different way. A sofa with books stacked on the arms instead of cushions, a jumper tossed over the back of a chair, a mug with a drying circle of coffee at the bottom on the floor near the window, and against the wall that backed onto my bedroom, the piano. It was an old, upright, dark wood polished in some places and worn to a gentle matte softness in others. The keys were not perfectly white or black anymore, but the off-shades of a life well used. He set the candle on top of it. "Would you like to sit?" he asked, nodding at the bench. I nodded and lowered myself onto the narrow seat. The wood was cool through the thin cotton of my t-shirt. I folded my hands in my lap, then realised that made me look like a schoolgirl and rested them on either side of me instead. He sat down beside me. We both stared at the keys for a moment, as if they were a third person in the room we'd been talking around for weeks. "You look exactly like someone who listens," he said suddenly. I turned my head. "What does that mean?" His eyes met mine. In the candlelight, they looked almost amber. "It means you have that thing," he said slowly, "where your whole body is in the room, not just your ears. You feel sound. I could tell from your notes." I swallowed. The compliment landed somewhere lower than my heart, my chest, my stomach, my thighs. "And you?" I replied. "You sound exactly like someone who thinks emotions are safer when you call them melodies." The corner of his mouth curved. "You might not be wrong," he said. His voice dropped half a register on the last word. He placed his hands on the keys. The gesture was casual and intimate at once, like taking off a shirt you wear every day. "I'll start with the one you called Getting Lost and Found Again," he said, "since apparently you liked that." "I did," I whispered. He began to play. The sound was different up close, richer, fuller. I could hear the tiny imperfections, the faint click of a slightly loose key, the subtle catch in one note where the hammer was probably worn. The piano wasn't just sound now. It was breath, vibration, the soft creak of the bench under our combined weight. Our thighs were touching, not completely, just the side seam of my shorts against the worn denim of his jeans. But it was continuous from hip to knee, a quiet line of heat. As he played, his body moved with the music, not dramatically, just enough that I could feel the shift of muscle against me. His shoulder rounded forward on the sad parts, his spine lengthened on the climb of the melody. Each movement translated into my body like a shared breath. I realized I was gripping the edge of the bench a little too tightly. "Relax," he murmured, without looking up. "You're allowed to enjoy it." "I am enjoying it," I said. My voice sounded husky in my own ears. "I know," he replied. "That's what I'm saying." The piece swelled, then quietened. His left hand held a low note, a soft, steady pulse, while the right danced delicately above it. Without thinking, I lifted my hand and let my fingers rest lightly on his forearm, just below the elbow. The muscle tightened under my touch. For half a second the melody wavered, then recovered. He kept playing, but his skin was warmer where my hand lay. I felt like I'd just stepped off the edge of something I'd been standing on for a very long time. He finished the piece, letting the last chord hang in the air until the sound dissolved into the faint hiss of the storm outside. We didn't move. His hands rested on the keys. Mine rested on his arm. Our thighs pressed together. The candle flame shivered slightly in the draught. When he finally turned to look at me, the space between us felt terribly small. "In your last note," he said quietly, "you wrote that sometimes it feels like my music is touching you." I swallowed. "I did," I admitted. He held my gaze. "Would it be completely wrong," he went on, each word careful, "if tonight it was actually me?" My heart hammered against my ribs, not from fear, from recognition, from the simple, dizzying fact that someone was asking me out loud to let myself be wanted. "No," I whispered. "It wouldn't be wrong." He didn't rush. He lifted his free hand, the one that wasn't still under my fingers on his arm, and brought it slowly towards me. I watched it come, the way you watch a wave, knowing exactly when it will reach you. He cupped my cheek, his palm warm, his thumb brushing the edge of my jaw. My skin prickled under his touch, as if it had been waiting for this for years. "Okay?" he asked. I nodded, the slightest movement against his hand. He leaned in. The first touch of his lips was barely more than a question. Soft, tentative, a brush at the corner of my mouth, as if he was giving me one last chance to decide. I answered by closing the distance. The kiss deepened, slowly. No movie-style crash, no frantic grabbing. Just the gradual, careful discovery of how we fit together. His mouth was warm and tasted faintly of peppermint tea. I felt his stubble graze my upper lip, the rough, soft contrast sending a little spark all the way down my spine. His hand slid from my cheek to the back of my neck, fingers threading into my hair. My own hand moved from his arm to his shoulder, feeling the solid curve of muscle there through the thin cotton of his t-shirt. When he exhaled into my mouth, I felt my whole body answer. My back arched the smallest bit, my knees relaxing so my thigh pressed more firmly against his. The piano groaned quietly beneath us as we shifted. "This is," I whispered against his lips, not even sure what I wanted to say. "Late," he murmured back, his forehead resting against mine for a moment. "Very late." "Too late?" I asked. His smile was a breath against my skin. "For regret?" he said. "No, for staying half alive. Definitely." He kissed me again, harder this time, still not rough, but with a certainty that made my stomach twist in the most delicious way. His hand slipped to the small of my back, fingers spreading, drawing me closer, erasing the last of the careful distance we'd maintained. I felt the heat of him, the solid length of his body, the slow, unhurried way he explored my mouth as if he had all the time in the world. Somewhere in the background, the storm rattled the window. Inside, all I could hear was the faint ring of piano strings still settling and our uneven breathing. I won't tell you how far we went that night, Sherry, not because I'm ashamed, and not because I want to tease. but because there are parts of that evening that belong to the spaces between notes, not the notes themselves. I will tell you this. There was a moment when he stood behind me at the piano, his chest against my back, his arms reaching around me to guide my hands over the keys. His fingers rested lightly over mine, moving them into chords I'd watched for weeks, but never touched. "Feel it," he whispered against my ear. His breath was warm on my skin. "You don't have to get it right, you just have to feel it." The combination of his hands over mine, his body behind me, and the low notes vibrating under our fingers was almost more intimate than any bedroom I've ever stood in. And later, when we weren't sitting anymore, when the candle had burned low and the storm outside had become a steady, distant rain, there was a point at which I realized something important. It wasn't just my body he was waking up. It was the part of me that had stopped believing I was still allowed to be touched like this, with patience, with attention, with the kind of hunger that doesn't take, but invites. We didn't sleep much that night, not because of the storm. In the morning, the power was back. The fridge hummed again, lights flickered on in the stairwell, the world returned to its normal volume. I walked back to my own flat with my hair a mess and my t-shirt creased, but my step steady. I made coffee, sat on my bed, and looked at the wall between our bedrooms. It looked exactly the same as it had 2 days ago. Plain white paint, a small crack near the skirting board, a faint shadow where the head of the bed sat against it, and yet everything was different. At 10:22 that night, the piano started again. I was in my own bed this time. I'd showered, put on fresh pajamas, lit my own candle on the bedside table. I lay there, listening. The melody was new, gentle, uncomplicated, like someone playing with a smile. I turned onto my side, facing the wall, and laughed quietly into my pillow. I didn't press my palm against the paint this time. I didn't need the wall anymore to feel that he was there. "Sherry, I'm not writing to you to say, 'Look, I found a neighbour and we had great sex.' That's not the story I want you to tell. I want your listeners to hear about something else. That there are ways to be touched long before anyone's hands reach your skin. A voice, a piece of music, the knowledge that someone out there is moving through their own darkness at the same time as you. That desire doesn't always arrive in high heels and lipstick. Sometimes it shows up in pajamas with a mug of tea, lying very still in the dark, listening to a piano through a wall. For a long time after my divorce, I thought that chapter of my life was over, that the most I could hope for was polite companionship, maybe a few awkward dates in bright cafes, lots of talk about where we see ourselves in 5 years, and then going home to a bed that always felt a little too large. I didn't expect the first man to truly reach me again to do it with notes instead of words. And I didn't expect that it would be me, in the end, who had to open the door. Because that's the thing I want to say to any woman listening who recognizes herself in this. The world can knock on your wall every night. Someone can play their whole heart out next to you. But at some point you have to decide to answer, to write the note, to open the door, to say yes when someone asks if it would be so wrong to touch you. I don't know if my neighbour and I will end up with shared bills and a combined Netflix account one day. Maybe this will be a beautiful, strange chapter between 2 longer books. Maybe it will be the beginning of something I don't yet have a name for. What I do know is that I am not the same woman who unpacked her boxes in an empty flat and pretended she didn't mind the silence. Now, when I lie in bed at night, I don't listen just to the piano. I listen to my own body, The way my chest rises, the way my pulse quickens on certain notes, the way my skin hums when I remember his hands guiding mine over the keys. For the first time in years, I feel tuned. If you'd like, you can read my story aloud. Maybe some other woman, lying in a half-empty bed, will hear it and realise that her own walls aren't as solid as she thinks. That there might already be music on the other side, waiting for her to press her palm against it. Your listener, Elle. Elle didn't go looking for fireworks. She just went to bed in an old t-shirt and listened. Her story is a reminder that you can be touched long before anyone's hands reach your skin, and that at some point you're allowed to be the one who opens the door and say yes. I'm Sherry Pearl, and this was Dust of Passion Stories.